In a courtroom thick with anticipation, an unsettling silence descended when a deaf woman's urgent signing went unanswered. The woman, Marisol Vega, stood at the defense table, her brow furrowed with confusion as she desperately sought her interpreter. Unbeknownst to her and to everyone else in the room, the interpreter, Naomi Clark, was not merely delayed. She was in custody. Judge Frank Caprio, a man known for his compassionate approach to justice, noticed the distress in Marisol's body language. He inquired about the interpreter's whereabouts, only to learn the shocking truth from a hesitant Miss Reyes, the clerk. The interpreter was unavailable, detained overnight for allegedly obstructing a police officer. The air in the courtroom seemed to freeze. Judge Caprio, his movements deliberate and grave, carefully placed his glasses on the bench, a clear signal that the proceedings were about to be disrupted by an unforeseen injustice. "In custody?" he echoed, his voice laced with disbelief. "The interpreter, who is supposed to provide this woman with her constitutional right to understand these proceedings, is in jail?" Miss Reyes confirmed the disturbing news, explaining that Naomi Clark had been arrested the previous night. The charge? Obstruction of a police officer. A palpable tension filled the room as Judge Caprio leaned forward, his voice measured but firm. The interpreter, who was supposed to ensure this defendant could communicate with law enforcement, was arrested for obstruction while trying to ensure this defendant could communicate with law enforcement. Marisol, oblivious to the legal intricacies unfolding around her, continued to sign, her frustration growing with each unanswered question. Her isolation was profound, a stark reminder of the barriers faced by those with disabilities. Judge Caprio's gaze swept across the courtroom, taking in the silent gallery and settling on Officer D'Angelo, the bailiff. The unasked question hung heavy in the air. How could such a blatant violation of rights occur? Miss Reyes, her discomfort evident, began to read the charges against Marisol Vega. Failure to comply with lawful commands, resisting arrest, reckless driving, and failure to appear for a scheduled court hearing. Judge Caprio raised a hand, silencing her. He turned his attention to Marisol, speaking slowly and deliberately, even though he knew she couldn't hear him. "Miss Vega, can you hear me?" Marisol shook her head, her eyes fixed on his lips. She signed again, her gestures careful and precise. Judge Caprio turned to the clerk, his voice laced with urgency. "Does anyone in this courtroom know American Sign Language?" Silence was the only answer. He then addressed the prosecutor. "Does your office have an interpreter available?" The prosecutor hesitated. "Not immediately, Your Honor." A quiet sharpness crept into Judge Caprio's voice. "We cannot proceed until communication is equal. This is not optional." He directed Miss Reyes to retrieve the file on Naomi Clark's arrest, demanding to know why she was in custody and unable to fulfill her duty. Miss Reyes quickly complied, reading from the screen that Naomi Clark had been detained at approximately 8:47 p.m. the previous evening following a traffic stop involving the defendant. The arresting officer, Daniel Kim, claimed that Miss Clark had refused multiple commands to step back from the scene and was therefore charged with obstruction. Judge Caprio's jaw tightened. "Step back from the scene?" he repeated, his voice dripping with incredulity. While interpreting for a deaf woman who was being detained, Miss Reyes nodded, confirming the absurdity of the situation. The jail log excerpt echoed the same sentiment. Interpreter detained overnight. Reason: persistent demands. Judge Caprio silently reviewed the file, his expression growing increasingly grave. He looked up, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and disbelief. "Let me understand this," he began, his voice low and controlled. "Miss Vega was pulled over. She is profoundly deaf. She requested an interpreter. An interpreter arrived. The interpreter attempted to facilitate communication, and the officer arrested the interpreter for doing her job. The prosecutor attempted to interject, but Judge Caprio cut him off. "I don't care what the report indicates," he said quietly. "I care what the law requires. And the law requires that a deaf person be provided meaningful access to communication during any interaction with law enforcement. That's not a courtesy. It's the Americans with Disabilities Act." He turned to Officer D'Angelo, his voice brooking no argument. "Bring Officer Kim into this courtroom now." Marisol's hands moved again, her desperate questions lost in the silence of the courtroom. Her isolation deepened with each passing moment. Judge Caprio looked at her, his voice softer now, though he knew she couldn't hear him. "Miss Vega, I'm going to make sure you understand everything that happens here. That's a promise." He instructed Miss Reyes to contact the jail and demand Naomi Clark's immediate release, ordering a review of the obstruction charge and a full report on why a certified interpreter was arrested for interpreting. As Miss Reyes made the call, Judge Caprio leaned back, his mind racing through the details of the case. He reread the custody logs, the transcript of what had transpired at the jail. Naomi Clark's words, preserved in the official record, painted a disturbing picture of ignorance and indifference. She had insisted that Marisol needed ASL access. She had explained that Marisol could not understand verbal commands. She had pointed out that Marisol was reaching for a laminated card identifying herself as deaf in both English and Spanish. She had pleaded with the officers to wait, to allow her to interpret, to follow the law. But the officers had dismissed her concerns, telling her to stop interfering, claiming her signing was making things harder, that she was creating a disturbance. They threatened her with arrest if she didn't step back. She refused to abandon Marisol, and they arrested her. Marisol spent a terrifying night in a holding cell, completely cut off from the world, unable to communicate with anyone. She signed to the walls, to the officers, to the other detainees, but no one understood. No one responded. She cried and signed and cried some more, her pleas for understanding lost in the cacophony of the jail. The courtroom door swung open, and Officer Daniel Kim entered, his face a mask of professional composure. He was sworn in and took the witness stand, ready to recount his version of the events. Judge Caprio's voice was calm but firm. "Officer Kim, tell the court what happened on the night of November 3rd. Kim opened his notebook, his voice steady and rehearsed. He described observing Marisol's vehicle speeding, initiating a traffic stop, and the driver's apparent failure to respond to his commands. He claimed she appeared to be ignoring him, reaching towards the glove compartment despite his orders to stop and show her hands. Judge Caprio leaned forward, his eyes fixed on the officer. "Did the driver say anything to you?" "No, Your Honor." She was silent. "Did she make any gestures?" Kim hesitated, his face betraying his discomfort. "She was moving her hands. It looked like gestures, hand motions." Judge Caprio pressed him, his voice deliberate. "Did it occur to you that she might be using sign language?" Kim's face flushed. "Not at the time, Your Honor." Judge Caprio continued, his voice unwavering. "What happened next?" Kim described the arrival of the interpreter, Naomi Clark, and her attempts to communicate with the driver. He claimed she refused to step back, insisted he couldn't question the driver without an interpreter, and interfered with his commands, leading to her arrest for obstruction. A profound silence descended upon the courtroom. Judge Caprio spoke softly, his words carrying the weight of their implications. "Officer, if a person cannot hear your commands, failure cannot be defiance." Kim looked down, shame creeping into his expression. "I didn't realize she was deaf until the interpreter told me." "And when the interpreter told you, what did you do?" Judge Caprio pressed. "I told her to step back so I could complete the stop." "Did you request an interpreter through official channels?" "No, Your Honor. I thought I could handle it by arresting the interpreter." Judge Caprio turned to Miss Reyes, his voice sharp with urgency. "Are there any ADA-related documents in this file?" Miss Reyes opened a folder, her voice tinged with disbelief as she read aloud. "Yes, Your Honor. Miss Vega submitted an ASL interpreter request form 2 months ago when she received a parking citation. The form was submitted to the court clerk's office, the traffic division, and the prosecutor's office. It included her contact information, her interpreter's contact information, and a request that all future interactions include ASL access." Judge Caprio's expression hardened. So the system knew. The system was notified, and the system ignored it. Miss Reyes continued, There are also 3 emails from the interpreter's agency requesting confirmation that an interpreter would be provided for any court appearances or law enforcement interactions. None of the emails were answered. Judge Caprio leaned back, his voice dripping with sarcasm. None were answered. Miss Reyes turned another page, her voice barely above a whisper. There's also a voicemail transcript from the jail supervisor to the interpreter's agency. It was left at 11:03 p.m. on November 3rd. It says, "We don't pay interpreters at night. She'll have to write notes." The room went cold, the casual disregard for Marisol's rights hanging heavy in the air. Judge Caprio's voice was soft, almost surgical, as he dissected the systemic failures that had led to this moment. Rights are not a luxury item. They are not budget-dependent. He turned to the prosecutor, his voice laced with controlled fury. "Does your office have a position on this?" The prosecutor stood, his voice uncertain and defensive. "Your Honor, the department is reviewing the procedures." "Reviewing?" Judge Caprio interrupted, his voice rising in disbelief. "A woman was arrested for being deaf. An interpreter was arrested for interpreting. And the system is reviewing procedures?" The courtroom door opened once more, and Naomi Clark entered, escorted by Officer D'Angelo. She looked exhausted, her clothes rumpled from a night in jail, but her eyes shone with unwavering resolve. Judge Caprio stood, the first time anyone had seen him rise during the hearing. "Miss Clark," he said, his voice filled with sincerity, "on behalf of this court, I apologize. What was done to you was wrong. What was done to Miss Vega was wrong, and I intend to make sure it doesn't happen again." Naomi's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded, her gratitude evident. Judge Caprio gestured to the witness stand, his voice urgent. "Please, I need you to interpret, and I need to hear what happened." Naomi took the stand and turned to Marisol, signing with gentle reassurance. Marisol's face flooded with relief, her hands moving quickly, urgently, pouring out her confusion and fear. Naomi interpreted, her voice trembling slightly. "She's asking what's happening. She's asking if she's going to jail. She's asking why no one would talk to her." Judge Caprio's voice was gentle and soothing. "Tell her she's not going to jail. Tell her I'm going to make sure she understands everything from this moment forward." Naomi signed, and Marisol's shoulders relaxed, the tension slowly draining from her body. Judge Caprio turned to Naomi, his voice filled with respect. "Miss Clark, tell the court what happened on November 3rd. Naomi's voice was steady as she recounted the events of that night. She described receiving a call from a bystander about a deaf woman being stopped by police and unable to communicate. She drove to the scene and found Officer Kim shouting at Marisol, who was signing that she was deaf and reaching for a card explaining her disability. Officer Kim, she said, seemed to think she was reaching for a weapon. "I approached," Naomi continued, "and identified myself as a certified ASL interpreter. I told him she was deaf and couldn't hear his commands. He told me to step back. I explained that she needed an interpreter to understand what was happening. He said I was interfering. I said the ADA requires an interpreter. He said if I didn't step back, I'd be arrested. I said I couldn't step back because she had no way to communicate without me." Her voice cracked slightly. "So he arrested me." Judge Caprio's gaze moved to Officer Kim, his expression unwavering. "Is that accurate?" Kim nodded, his head bowed in shame. "Yes, Your Honor." "And what did you say to Miss Clark when she told you about the ADA?" Judge Caprio pressed. Kim hesitated, his voice barely audible. "I said her signing was making things harder." The room froze, the weight of those words hanging heavy in the air. It took a full 12 seconds for the shock and disbelief to dissipate, for the full impact of his ignorance to resonate through the courtroom. Judge Caprio's voice, when it finally came, was quieter than before, but sharper, more dangerous. American Sign Language is not interference. It is communication. Judge Caprio opened the file again, his eyes scanning the evidence. Then, he began to deliver his verdict, his voice resonating with righteous anger. "Here's what the evidence shows. Miss Vega is profoundly deaf. She submitted an ADA request form 2 months ago. The system ignored it. She was pulled over for a minor traffic violation. She could not hear the officer's commands. She attempted to communicate through sign language and by reaching for an identification card. The officer misinterpreted her actions as non-compliance. An interpreter arrived to provide legally required access. The officer arrested the interpreter for providing that access. Miss Vega spent the night in custody without any means of communication. The jail refused to provide an interpreter because it was after hours. He paused, his gaze sweeping across the courtroom. Every single one of those actions violated the Americans with Disabilities Act. Every single one of them violated Miss Vega's constitutional rights, and every single one of them is unacceptable. He turned to Marisol, his voice softening as Naomi interpreted his words. Miss Vega, all charges against you are dismissed. Your arrest record will be expunged. You will receive a formal apology from this court and from the Providence Police Department. You will be compensated for the interpreter fees that should have been provided at the time of your stop and during your detention. Marisol's hands moved, her question filled with vulnerability and fear. Naomi interpreted. Her voice choked with emotion. She's asking if she did something wrong. Judge Caprio's voice was gentle and reassuring. Tell her no. Tell her the system failed her. And tell her I'm going to make sure it doesn't fail anyone else. He turned to Officer Kim, his voice stern. Officer, you will complete a 40-hour ADA compliance training course. You will submit a written report on disability rights in law enforcement, and you will personally apologize to Miss Vega and Miss Clark. He then addressed the prosecutor, his voice leaving no room for argument. Your office will review Miss Clark's obstruction charge. I expect it to be dismissed within 24 hours. She will also receive compensation for her unlawful detention. Finally, he turned to Miss Reyes, outlining the systemic changes that would be implemented immediately. This court will establish a 24-hour ASL interpreter hotline for all law enforcement interactions. Every officer in the Providence Police Department will complete mandatory disability awareness training within 60 days. A custody ADA compliance officer will be appointed to ensure that all detainees with disabilities receive appropriate accommodations. And any future ADA request form submitted to this court will be flagged and confirmed within 48 hours. Judge Caprio leaned forward, his voice filled with passion. Disability is not defiance. Silence is not resistance. It may be a language you never learned. He paused, his gaze sweeping across the courtroom. Miss Reyes, prepare a full report on this case. I want it sent to the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division. I want them to know what happened here and what we're doing to fix it. He turned back to Naomi Clark, his voice filled with gratitude and respect. Miss Clark, thank you for standing up for Miss Vega. You upheld the law when others ignored it. That took courage and it cost you a night in jail. I'm sorry for that. This court is grateful for what you did. Naomi signed to Marisol, and Marisol signed back, her gratitude overflowing. Naomi's voice was soft with emotion. She says thank you. She says she thought no one would listen. Judge Caprio looked at Marisol, his voice filled with sincerity. Tell her I listened. Tell her this court listened. And tell her that from now on the system will listen too. The hearing was drawing to a close, but Judge Caprio had one final gesture of reconciliation and understanding to offer. He turned to Naomi Clark, his eyes filled with genuine warmth. Miss Clark, I have one more request. I'd like you to teach me 2 signs. I want to say something to Miss Vega directly. The courtroom fell silent. Every eye fixed on the judge. Naomi stepped down from the witness stand and approached the bench, demonstrating 2 simple signs. Judge Caprio watched carefully, practicing the gestures until he was confident he could convey his message. He turned to Marisol, his hands raised in a gesture of humility and respect. He signed slowly, carefully, his eyes filled with empathy. I'm sorry. Marisol's eyes filled with tears, her heart overflowing with gratitude. Judge Caprio signed again, his message clear and heartfelt. Thank you. Marisol signed back, her hands moving in a gesture that needed no translation. She placed her hand over her heart and bowed her head slightly, a silent expression of profound respect and appreciation. Naomi's voice was barely a whisper, filled with emotion. "She says you gave her voice back." Judge Caprio shook his head, his voice filled with humility. "No, she always had a voice. We just weren't listening." Justice had spoken in silence, a powerful reminder of the importance of accessibility and understanding. 3 weeks later, the Providence Police Department launched a comprehensive disability rights training program, ensuring that every officer understood their obligations under the Americans with Disabilities Act. Officer Kim was among the first to graduate, his final essay, titled "The Language I Didn't Know," a testament to his newfound awareness and understanding. The 24-hour ASL interpreter hotline proved to be a lifeline for countless individuals, receiving 32 calls in its first month alone. 32 people who might have been wrongly arrested for non-compliance were instead given the communication access they needed, preventing misunderstandings and ensuring their rights were protected. Naomi Clark's obstruction charge was dismissed with prejudice, and she received a formal apology from the city, along with full compensation for her unlawful detention and lost wages. Marisol Vega's arrest record was expunged, and she received a personal apology from the police chief, acknowledging the injustice she had suffered. She also received a call from the mayor, who thanked her for exposing the gaps in the system and inspiring meaningful change. The court's ADA request forms were redesigned, made accessible in ASL video format, large print, Braille, and 15 written languages, ensuring that everyone could easily request the accommodations they needed. Every form submission triggered an automatic confirmation and a follow-up call, guaranteeing that no one would be overlooked. The Department of Justice reviewed Judge Caprio's report, using it as a model case study for ADA compliance in municipal courts nationwide, setting a new standard for accessibility and inclusion. Judge Caprio kept a note card on his desk, handwritten with a simple but profound message. "Silence is not resistance. It may be a language you never learned." He looked at it every morning before court began, a constant reminder of his commitment to justice for all. And on the wall behind his bench, visible to everyone who entered the courtroom, was a small framed sign in American Sign Language, a symbol of his unwavering dedication to equality. It said, "Justice for all and everyone."